Today we will study and reflect on the conflicts between Booker T. Washington, who encouraged blacks to get an education so that they would have marketable skills to be submissive and hardworking, and the activist W.E.B. Du Bois, who encouraged blacks to insist on their civil rights, dignity, and equal opportunity. In our first video in this series, we examined the life of W.E.B. Du Bois during his school and college years, and in his early years as professor in black colleges before he gained national prominence. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in our PowerPoint script posted to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. W.E.B. Du Bois belonged to the third generation of black leaders. Frederick Douglass belonged to the first generation of black leaders. He was an abolitionist orator who was born around 1817 and escaped from slavery in the 1830s. Booker T. Washington belongs to the second generation of black leaders. He died in 1915, aged 59, while W.E.B. Du Bois belongs to the third generation of black leaders. He died in 1963 at age 95. Now, as W.E.B. Du Bois, our contrarian activist leader, rose in prominence in the black civil rights movement, he came into conflict with the accommodationist Booker T. Washington, founder of the Tuskegee Institute. Now, Booker T. Washington was an excellent administrator and delegator. He not only believed that the staff should help build the school, they should learn how to run the school also. When Tuskegee really started expanding, he would spend 6 months out of every year crisscrossing northern cities, giving lectures and visiting philanthropists, looking for additional funding for the black colleges and his other projects. Booker T. Washington knew how to dwell on the positive, praising the many whites who supported black education, but not dwelling on the negative, including the many lynchings and humiliations and discriminations that dogged him and every black man of his era, so he could make a good impression with the moneyed white northern philanthropists and businessmen. Booker T. Washington was heavily criticized by both W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells for his accommodating position on lynchings. Sometimes he would even adopt the narrative that somehow the victims brought it upon themselves, or that they had improperly approached or molested white women, which was nearly always a lie, an all too common narrative by white supremacists. Booker T. Washington was always persistent in patience, and his persistence and patience paid off during the many years he spent fundraising. Usually, the really large donations came from businessmen he had been calling on for many, many years. The businessman who donated $5 this year might donate $5,000 a few years from now and $50,000 in his will. And the pinnacle of Booker T. Washington's fundraising and public relations efforts was the Atlanta Exposition of 1895 that he helped to organize and promote, and where he delivered the keynote speech known as the Atlanta Compromise. This was the very first time a black man addressed such a large and influential body of white businessmen and white national politicians. All the major newspapers in the country promoted the Atlanta Exposition. In his speech, Booker T. Washington rhetorically addressed both the black worker and the white businessman, but his real audience was the white businessman. He wanted to reassure them that the black workers were hardworking and was not too eager to rock the boat with talk about civil rights. One of his fears was that the white employers might, instead of employing blacks, employ cheap Chinese workers, as was the practice in California. But W.E.B. Du Bois was not a party to this careful compromise between Booker T. Washington and his wealthy donors. He wrote a newspaper article in Washington's 1895 speech, saying that there might be a basis for a real settlement between blacks and whites in the South if the South opened to the Negroes the doors of economic opportunity, and the Negroes cooperated with the white South in political sympathy. And this is the note that Du Bois wrote to congratulate Washington on his speech. But Du Bois continues, "But this offer was frustrated by the fact that between 1895 and 1909, the whole South disenfranchised its Negro voters by unfair and illegal restrictions and passed a series of Jim Crow laws which demoted the Negro citizen to a subordinate caste." And the national debut of W.E.B. Du Bois was his article in the Atlanta magazine in 1897, Strivings of the Negro People. Many of these thoughts would be repeated in the opening chapter of The Souls of Black Folk, entitled Of Our Spiritual Strivings, which included a criticism of the teaching and civil rights credos which Booker T. Washington had espoused. In 1898, W.E.B. Du Bois accepted a position as head of the sociology department at Atlanta University. Tuskegee Institute and Howard University had been holding annual conferences on agricultural and trade issues for rural blacks who attended these industrial schools. So the year before Du Bois was hired, Atlanta University hosted annual conferences that were more centered on the needs of blacks who lived in cities. W.E.B. Du Bois's biographer Lewis stated that the creed of the 1890s, as put forth by the Tuskegee trade school movement, held that it was a dangerous conceit to expose black people to literature, history, philosophy, and dead languages, thereby spoiling them for the natural order of Southern society in which their place was of voteless, industrious farmhands, primary school teachers, and occasional merchants. But Atlanta University did not reject industrial training school courses, but their industrial courses were reinforced by liberal arts rather than undermined by them. And the struggle between the accommodationist Tuskegee machine and the activists was harming the funding sources of Atlanta University. W.E.B. Du Bois explains, Atlanta University from the beginning had taken a strong and unbending attitude towards Negro prejudice and discrimination. White teachers and black students ate together in the same dining room and lived in the same dormitories, which also caused them to lose their annual land grant appropriation from the legislature. The state of Georgia also took issue with the university permitting the white students who were the children of their white professors attending school with black students. Even though the industrial training in many black colleges, including Tuskegee, was often done by Atlanta graduates, W.E.B. Du Bois said that the controversy between him and Booker T. Washington became more personal and bitter than I had ever dreamed, and which necessarily dragged in the university. W.E.B. Du Bois underestimated the vast influence of the Tuskegee machine when it interfered with the university's fundraising. Why was the Tuskegee philosophy so popular with whites? W.E.B. Du Bois believed that this philosophy seemed to say that the attempt to overeducate a child race by furnishing college degrees to its promising young people must be discouraged. In a world ruled by white people, the place of the Negro must be that of a humble, patient, hardworking group of laborers, whose ultimate destiny would be determined by their white employers. College was for whites, elementary training and training in farming and industry was for blacks, to make the mass of Negro laborers content with their lot and cheap to hire. W.E.B. Du Bois also notes, in 1903, Andrew Carnegie made the future of Tuskegee certain by a gift of $600,000, a tidy sum back in the day. These were the years when the Tuskegee machine held the most influence. Tuskegee became the capital of the Negro Nation. Negro newspapers were influenced, and finally the oldest and largest was bought by the Friends of Tuskegee. Most of the other colored papers found it to their advantage not to oppose Mr. Washington, even if they did not wholly agree with him. W.E.B. Du Bois resented this choking of criticism by the Tuskegee machine, but he was also torn. He also considered a job offer from Tuskegee Institute, but he decided against accepting it. He feared that he would sink to the level of a ghostwriter. And there were efforts to repair the rift between them. They met several times. And W.E.B. Du Bois recalls how different they were. He was quick, fast-talking, and voluble, while Booker T. Washington was wary and silent, carefully measuring his words until he knew what his opponent's wishes or desires were. Now, in my opinion, W.E.B. Du Bois misinterpreted this cautious speech as suspicion. In essence, W.E.B. Du Bois was accusing Booker T. Washington of behaving like a salesman, which indeed he was. He even has a chapter in his autobiography on sales techniques he honed from years of calling on white businessmen. And the picture, of course, is when Theodore Roosevelt went to speak at Tuskegee Institute with Booker T. Washington in 1905. Now, these efforts at reconciliation were dashed when he released his collection of essays, Souls of Black Folk, including a chapter of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others. W.E.B. Du Bois concludes this chapter. So far as Mr. Washington preaches thrift, patience, and industrial training for the masses, we must hold up his hands and strive with him, rejoicing in his honors. But so far as Mr. Washington apologizes for injustice, North or South, does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting, belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinctions, and opposes the higher training and ambition of our brighter minds, we must unceasingly and firmly oppose him. W.E.B. Du Bois continues, by every civilized and peaceful method, we must strive for the rights which the world accords to men, clinging unwaveringly to those great words of our founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we'll talk about the next phase of his life when he founded the Niagara Movement and the Talented Tenth. W.E.B. Du Bois compared the ideological differences between his Talented Tenth movement and the beliefs of Booker T. Washington. W.E.B. Du Bois believed in providing a liberal arts education for the talented tenth who, through their knowledge of modern culture, could guide the American Negro into a higher civilization. In contrast, Booker T. Washington believed that through hard work and pinching pennies, blacks could eventually improve their lives. However, Booker T. Washington did not oppose college education for blacks, as his own children attended college. He proposed to emphasize training blacks in agriculture and the skilled trades. The problem is that blacks were unable to ever accumulate capital as long as the Jim Crow system exploited their labor. Accumulating capital is the phrase Booker T. Washington and many whites preferred. In many places, I substitute pinching pennies for accumulating capital, because if you're paid starvation wages, you cannot accumulate capital. You cannot even save your pennies. Disenchanted with the Tuskegee leadership, in 1905, W.E.B. Du Bois sent invitations to black leaders for a conference to be held at Niagara Falls. 29 black leaders agreed on these principles for the Niagara Movement: freedom of speech and criticism, an unfettered and unsubsidized press, manhood suffrage, the abolition of all caste distinctions based simply on race and color, the recognition that the highest and best human training should not be monopolized by any class or race, a belief in the dignity of labor, and a united effort to realize these ideals under wise and courageous leadership. Although W.E.B. Du Bois did not come up with the idea of the NAACP, he was invited to be one of the founding members. Attendance at the Niagara Conference tapered off during the next few years, but in effect this movement merged with the NAACP, which was a new organization founded in 1909 by a group of white liberals and black leaders. W.E.B. Du Bois was invited to join and became the editor of the movement's magazine, The Crisis. When he joined the NAACP, he resigned from his professorship at Atlanta University, so their fundraising could be revived in his absence. W.E.B. Du Bois was permitted the freedom to express his own opinions, as they were in general agreement with those of the NAACP. W.E.B. Du Bois wisely refused to be the executive of this new organization. He knew he was a thinker and a contrarian, not a manager. W.E.B. Du Bois said the NAACP organizing conference had 4 groups: scientists who knew the race problem, philanthropists willing to help worthy causes, social workers ready to take up a new task of abolition, Negroes ready to join a new crusade for their emancipation, and another very important group that would form soon after their founding was the lawyers they hired to pursue cases to fight segregation. W.E.B. Du Bois would be the editor of The Crisis for 24 years, from 1910 through 1934. The circulation started at 1,000 and climbed to 100,000 by 1918. In addition to the magazine, W.E.B. Du Bois continued to publish his books. The NAACP slowly eclipsed the Tuskegee machine in its influence among black leaders. In his autobiography, W.E.B. Du Bois says that he was not eager to attack the efforts by Booker T. Washington, but he does offer this valid criticism. Mr. Washington's large financial responsibilities have made him dependent on the rich charitable public that he has been compelled to tell, not the whole truth, but that part which certain powerful interests in America, white America, wish to appear as the whole truth. Again, W.E.B. Du Bois is accusing Booker T. Washington of being a salesman, which he certainly was. W.E.B. Du Bois bemoans how, under the Democratic Wilson administration in 1915, a flood of racial discriminatory legislation is passed by Congress. Then he mentions, in passing, in mid-sentence, how Booker T. Washington died that year. Now, his biographer Lewis recalls W.E.B. Du Bois's farewell to Booker T. Washington in the pages of The Crisis. Washington's death marked an epoch in the history of America. He was the greatest Negro leader since Frederick Douglass, and the most distinguished man, white or black, to emerge from the South since the Civil War. There was much to thank him for. Tuskegee, and the ideal of interracial cooperation in the South, the encouragement of thrift and business among African Americans, and the acquisition of land. But W.E.B. Du Bois qualifies his praise of Booker T. Washington even in his obituary. Stern justice commanded that we must lay on the soul of this man a heavy responsibility for Negroes losing the right to vote, the decline of the Negro college and public school, and the firmer establishment of color caste in this land. And personally, I think he's being a little bit harsh in his criticism here in a way, because these things would have happened no matter what he would have done. In his autobiography, Booker T. Washington does not mention his conflicts with W.E.B. Du Bois. I could not find his rival's name in this work. Perhaps he was sensitive to some of his rival's criticisms. He is careful that not only does he champion black suffrage, but he starkly opposes lynching in his autobiography. The main theme is how blacks can improve their lot by gaining a valuable skill set, working hard, and not making waves by being good employees. We like our biographer Lewis's description of Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery. The work was vintage American, faith in God and hard work, overcoming bleakest adversity. The cast of edifying characters included an unlettered, devoted mother, aristocratic and kindly white families, the white matron who admitted him to Hampton after a parlor-sweeping examination, and the father figure General Armstrong, who was the headmaster of Howard University, his alma mater, and his Gospel of the Toothbrush. The visionary ex-slave property owner Lewis Adams, who negotiated Tuskegee's existence, Washington's self-sacrificing wives, and his good friend, the wealthy Andrew Carnegie. Now, what is meant by the Gospel of the Toothbrush? Plantation slaves in the Deep South were treated like talking livestock. Many slaves were only given one change of clothes a year. Nobody gave their slaves toothbrushes. Plantation slaves were not taught table manners because they had no room for tables in their one-room dirt floor shacks. They ate in the field, and some cruel owners even fed colored children like they fed their hogs, out of trough. But educated blacks, after emancipation, were expected to have manners, so black colleges included courses on etiquette and table manners. Booker T. Washington, who was himself a former plantation slave, appreciated these etiquette classes at Hampton University and duplicated them at Tuskegee. Our biographer notes that behind the scenes, Booker T. Washington funded many individual civil rights initiatives. Thomas Sowell writes this: Booker T. Washington privately not only supported efforts to safeguard civil rights, but also wrote anonymous newspaper articles protesting the violation of these rights, as did his trusted agents. He secretly financed legal challenges to Jim Crow laws, sometimes secretly paying the legal fees for black defendants. Booker T. Washington also worked behind the scenes to get federal appointments for blacks in Washington and postmaster appointments in Alabama, as well as lobbying presidents to appoint federal judges who would give blacks a fairer hearing. Now, in other sources I have read that Booker T. Washington secretly helped fund the NAACP, but that's not mentioned in the sources for this video, so maybe it's not true. We do know that Booker T. Washington was not interested in discussing his disagreements with W.E.B. Du Bois in his autobiography. Perhaps he anticipated that a new generation of black activist leaders would take a more activist stance, and perhaps he simply wished that W.E.B. Du Bois had been born a decade or two later to give him a little less trouble. After the death of Booker T. Washington, the Tuskegee machine declined in influence. W.E.B. Du Bois's NAACP became the leading civil rights organization. In our next video, we'll discuss how W.E.B. Du Bois would live into his 90s, passing away 4 decades later in 1963. During this time, the country experienced 2 world wars, the Depression, the Cold War, and the civil rights successes of the 50s and 60s. And now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. We prefer reading the autobiographies of black civil rights leaders because we want them to speak for themselves. We especially enjoy reading W.E.B. Du Bois's descriptions of the many challenges he faced in his life with surprising self-revelations, and likewise for Booker T. Washington, his description of what it was like to live as a slave was absolutely captivating, as was his climb out of slavery to be one of the leading spokesmen of blacks in the country, as well as his many close relationship with leading white businessmen and philanthropists. And the excellent biography by David Levering Lewis did provide interesting independent observations about the complex relationship between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
For this phase of his life, there are many sources, but he also heavily relies on the two autobiographies. And of course, one of the sources for the autobiography of W.E.B. Du Bois is The Soul of Black Folk, which includes many of the original autobiographical essays. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.